A passenger tried to torture a black CEO mid-flight, but the moment of payback no one saw coming changed everything. He thought pouring fire into another man's wounds would make him superior. He didn't realize the man he tortured had endured worse and would return every ounce of pain. Subscribe if you believe cruelty always burns back. The first jolt came mid-air, sharp, sudden, and almost rhythmic. The plane buckled lightly against the turbulence, seatbelt signs flickering above like silent warnings. In that exact moment, the coffee cup tilted dangerously in Jace Mallon's trembling grip. A splash of steaming liquid arced forward, landing directly on Adrian Varen's left sleeve. Adrian's sharp inhale wasn't from pain, but from surprise. The wet warmth quickly seeped into the cotton, reaching the medical gauze underneath. His jaw tightened as he gently peeled back the damp fabric, exposing a blood-stained bandage that covered the still sensitive shoulder wound from last week's crash. A second-degree burn now layered itself over his healing skin. But he didn't flinch. He offered only a composed nod to the young male attendant, whose eyes flitted from the coffee stain to Adrian's unreadable expression. "My apologies, sir," Jace said, voice taut with a rehearsed politeness. "Turbulence got the best of me." Adrian gave a soft, clipped response. "Accidents happen." He could have pressed the issue, demanded proper care or even medical attention. But that wasn't his way. Not here. Not in front of dozens of strangers. The boardroom was where he fought battles, not cabin aisles. Across the aisle, a passenger in a red jacket turned to the man seated beside him and chuckled low enough to seem private, but loud enough to be noticed. "Always treated special," he muttered. "Even get burns with extra sympathy." Adrian heard it. So did his assistant Leon, who shifted slightly beside him, eyes narrowing with quiet offense. But Adrian held up a hand subtly, a signal to let it go. The flight had barely begun. There was still a long way to Norvale, and his mind was focused on the final presentation of the Corin AI prototype. A decade's worth of work depended on these next few days. The red-jacketed man, Callan Rusk, wasn't done. He twisted halfway in his seat, speaking louder this time. "Tell me, do executives always fly first class because they're important, or because they want everyone else to think they are?" Adrian didn't look up. He calmly reached into his laptop case and pulled out his notepad. A physical one, bound in leather, its corners scuffed from years of use. He jotted down a phrase, underlined it once. "Ignore the bait. Focus forward." Callan scoffed at the lack of reaction, but there was a flicker in his expression. Irritation, maybe even confusion. He leaned back with a theatrical sigh, his voice slurring ever so slightly now. "Guess silence is the new power play." Adrian shifted slightly in his seat, suppressing the growing ache in his shoulder. He adjusted his jacket with a deliberate motion, revealing the white gauze now stained faintly pink beneath the sleeve. A physical wound, visible, raw, and quietly disrespected. Leon leaned closer. "You okay?" Adrian nodded once. "Just watch them." Both of them, Leon didn't ask why. He trusted Adrian's instincts, honed through years of leading Corin dynamics through both innovation and sabotage attempts. For a moment, the cabin returned to its rhythmic quiet. The engines hummed like a steady heartbeat, and overhead vents whispered cold air into the stillness. Passengers returned to their magazines, their tablets, their insulated worlds. But Adrian's mind refused to settle. He sensed it, the subtle storm gathering beneath the civil surface. He glanced around the cabin and noticed the small, almost imperceptible glances directed his way. Some passengers looked down quickly when he met their eyes. Others didn't bother to hide their curiosity. He wasn't imagining it. The tension had shape now. It pressed against his temples and curled under his skin like static before lightning. Callan Rusk had said too much for it to be casual prejudice, and Jace's spillage, clumsy but almost calculated in its aftermath, lingered in his memory. Adrian had faced rivals in boardrooms who smiled while sharpening blades under the table. He knew the look of rehearsed mistakes. He knew when disrespect wasn't accidental. It was a signal. And yet, he said nothing. He reopened his laptop, displaying the final diagnostics for the prototype system. A neural AI built to monitor post-surgical patients using real-time biofeedback and predictive care modeling. The kind of system that could change lives. The kind of system people would sabotage to prevent from ever reaching the market. The seatbelt light dinged off. The plane reached cruising altitude. But Adrian's focus wasn't on altitude anymore. It was on the two men in the second row. One sneering, one silent. He leaned back, closed his eyes for a brief moment, and breathed in deeply. Whatever this flight held, it had already shifted. The burn on his shoulder might have been the first blow, but it wouldn't be the last. He opened his eyes again, staring at the reflection of himself in the black screen of his tablet. Calm. Still. Unmoving. But inside, something stirred. He had no idea this flight would scar him far deeper than any blade could. The liquid hit his shoulder like fire. Adrian's scream cut through the hum of the cabin, sharp and guttural. The pain wasn't just a sting, it was a surge of flame that bit deep into the raw, healing flesh beneath his gauze. He lurched forward in his seat, instinctively shielding the wound with his other arm, but it was too late. The damage was done. His shirt darkened with a spreading stain, the bright red of hot sauce mixing with blood in a cruel smear. The smell was immediate and unmistakable. Vinegar, chili, garlic, acidic, pungent, invasive. Callan Rusk let out a barking laugh from across the aisle. "Thought a little flavor might help," he said, loud enough for half the cabin to hear, his voice soaked in mockery and malice. He leaned back, hands behind his head like he'd just delivered the punchline to a joke, completely unfazed by the horror painted on the faces of those nearby. Leon was on his feet in an instant. "What did you just do?" he demanded, his voice cracking with fury. His hands were clenched at his sides, shaking not just from rage, but from helplessness. He turned to the flight attendant standing nearest, Jace Mallon, still holding the empty plastic cup as if unsure what to do now that the damage had been done. "Get help." Now. But Jace didn't move. His mouth opened, then closed. His eyes darted between Adrian, the bloodied gauze, and Callan, who sat grinning like a man who knew he wouldn't face consequences. "It was just a mistake," Jace stammered. "It was. He didn't mean to." "Are you kidding me?" Leon's voice rose, drawing more attention. "You handed him that cup. You walked it over and gave it to him." Adrian didn't speak at first. He couldn't. The pain clawed through his shoulder like acid peeling back skin. Every nerve ending screamed, overwhelmed by the burn. But as he gritted his teeth, his vision began to clear, not from relief, but from focus. His breath came in controlled bursts, each one a struggle to keep from collapsing under the agony. And beneath it all, beneath the sting and the shock and the humiliation, something older stirred. Resolve. He looked at the trembling edge of his sleeve, soaked and sticky. The fluid had soaked through the gauze, reactivating the barely scabbed-over wound from surgery. The heat wasn't just on the surface, it was sinking deeper, raw nerves flaring like open wires. Around him, the cabin shifted. The low conversations had ceased. People watched. Some whispered. Others recorded with subtle angles from their phones, unsure what to do. A few turned away, eyes down, pretending not to see the assault happening just rows away. Adrian slowly straightened. He didn't wipe the blood. He didn't touch the cup. His body was rigid with pain, but his face began to settle into something colder, controlled. "Leon," he said softly, though every syllable was pressed out with effort. "Sit down." Leon hesitated. "Adrian." I said sit down. Reluctantly, Leon lowered himself back into the seat beside him, his jaw tight, his fists white. Adrian turned slightly, just enough to glance over his shoulder. He could see Callan still watching him, arms folded, that same twisted smirk glued to his face, the kind of expression worn by men who thought they'd already won. Adrian's voice, when it came again, was low and deliberate. "You think this is over because it hurt?" Callan raised his eyebrows in mock surprise. "Come on, man." "It was just a joke. Lighten up. No need to play the victim." Adrian didn't reply. He turned forward again, letting his silence speak. His hand reached for the armrest, gripping it tightly, not for support, but to anchor his fury. The metal felt cool beneath his fingers, a small contrast to the fire tearing through his shoulder. Jace finally found his voice. I can get some napkins." Leon snorted bitterly. "You should get a lawyer." I didn't know what was in the cup," Jace said, stepping back. "He asked me to bring it." "I didn't think." "You didn't ask either," Adrian cut in, his voice like sharpened steel. "You just followed orders." Jace paled. "I didn't know." "You knew enough not to stop him," Leon snapped. "You knew enough to hesitate when I asked for help." Jace's mouth opened, but he had no answer. He backed away toward the galley as if seeking shelter, bumping into another attendant who had been watching from the curtain, half hidden. Adrian closed his eyes briefly. The pain wasn't fading, but his focus was sharpening. He could feel the weight of the eyes on him, could hear the faint clicks of camera phones, the shallow breathing of passengers unsure whether to speak up or stay silent. The whole cabin had become a stage, and he, against his will, had become the centerpiece of a spectacle. But he would choose the ending. He opened his eyes and looked directly at Callan. "You just declared a war you don't understand." The cabin erupted into murmurs and shifting eyes the moment Adrian's scream cut through the hush. Jace Mallon, the attendant, fumbled with his hands, his face flushed with forced concern. It was an accident," he stammered, glancing nervously between Adrian's seared shoulder and the stunned passengers. Callan Rusk remained slouched in his seat, arms crossed, a crooked smile curling beneath his sneer. "Relax," he said, voice loud enough to slice through the tension. "It was just a joke. Some people really can't take heat." Leon sprang from his seat, stepping between Adrian and the others. "We need medical assistance now," he snapped, his voice firm with urgency. Jace hesitated. "The first aid kit, it's missing. The last turbulence must have knocked it loose. Adrian raised one hand, stopping him cold. "Don't," he said quietly, eyes locked on Jace. "You had one job." The pain was real, blazing, raw, but his mind sharpened beneath it. Every pulse of his shoulder became fuel. He forced himself to breathe through clenched teeth, forcing his body still. He was done being reactive. He needed to see. He scanned the cabin, row numbers, passenger faces. The way the man, 2 rows ahead, turned his phone camera ever so slightly, pretending not to film. The flight attendant lingering near the galley door, whispering with another male attendant. The smudge on the wall where the safety cabinet had been sealed shut. No sign of turbulence damage at all. He saw Callan's hand tremble. Just slightly. Not fear, adrenaline. That kind of tremor only came after planned action, not impulsive rage. "Captain," Adrian said, straightening in his seat despite the pain. "I want to speak to the captain." Jace stiffened, then shook his head. "Communications are restricted right now. Cockpits locked until landing. Regulation." That phrase, "communications are restricted." Adrian had heard it before, not during turbulence, not even during a technical failure. It had been used 7 years ago when a critical shipment of biometric chips from his lab was mysteriously diverted to customs hours before a major investor announcement. That delay had nearly collapsed his prototype's launch window. The incident was labeled an accident, until a whistleblower from a competing firm revealed the sabotage had been coordinated. He shifted his gaze to Leon, who had returned to his seat beside him. "They're trying to provoke me," Adrian said under his breath. "Document everything." Leon nodded, understanding instantly. His hand moved with practiced calm, slipping his phone from his pocket and angling it just enough to capture the aisle, Callan's posture, Jace's movements, everything. Adrian's skin still burned beneath the soaked fabric, but he was no longer focused on pain. He was dissecting a play. This wasn't about insult, it was about exposure. Orchestrated, coordinated, a setup dressed in chaos. A passenger stood to ask what had happened, but was hushed quickly by another man who wore a Helian airpin on his lapel, a junior crew member posing as a flyer. Adrian noted the badge, the gesture, the silence that followed. All of it too well-timed. Jace returned minutes later, now holding a handful of tissues and a bottle of water. His voice was lower, more careful. "Really, sorry about that," he murmured, avoiding eye contact. "Callan's had a drink too many." Just trying to keep things calm, Adrian didn't take the water. Instead, he leaned back in his seat and said nothing. His stillness was louder than rage. Callan glanced over and muttered again, "Real men don't flinch." But this time, Adrian didn't look at him. He watched the reflection in the window, Jace's hand nervously wiping his palms against his uniform, the faint outline of a communication earpiece just visible beneath his hair. Leon nudged him subtly and whispered, "That guy who hushed the question earlier." He just moved closer to the galley. "Track his badge," Adrian replied softly. "See if it's real." The flight attendants huddled again. Adrian caught just a few words, enough to freeze him in place. "Order from the top. Test reaction time. Revell Corporation." The name slammed into his thoughts like a dropped hammer. Revell, the same shadowy conglomerate that had lost the defense AI contract to Quran Dynamics last quarter. The one that had once filed a lawsuit against Adrian's team under false data claims. The one whose executives had refused to shake his hand during the last ethics summit. Now it all made sense. The provocation, the carefully framed accident, the blocked request to the cockpit. This wasn't spontaneous aggression, it was sabotage, designed to stain his name before his upcoming pitch in Norvale. He turned slowly in his seat and faced Callan. "You think I don't see it," he said, voice low but firm. "This isn't misbehavior." "It's orchestration," Callan rolled his eyes. "You're reaching, Doc. Nobody cares that much about your little invention." Adrian ignored him, looking instead at Jace. "Tell your employer this?" Jace flinched. Adrian's voice dropped to a near whisper. "You're not tormenting a victim. You're building my evidence." He turned forward again, his composure returned, the storm now sealed beneath a perfect calm. Pain fades, but exposure burns forever. 10 minutes had passed since the incident, but the tension in the cabin clung like humidity before a storm. Jace Mallon reappeared, his footsteps quieter this time, his hands clutching a wad of tissues that trembled faintly. He leaned in toward Adrian with a rehearsed softness, lowering his voice to a whisper. "Sir, he's just been drinking. He didn't mean anything by it. Just try not to escalate it." Adrian didn't respond. His eyes, calm but unreadable, remained locked on the seat back in front of him. The tissues hung limply between them for a few seconds before Jace slowly retreated, unsure whether he had diffused anything or merely lit another fuse. Without a word, Adrian reached down into his carry-on. His movements were deliberate, not sluggish from pain, but exact, mechanical. From a side pocket, he retrieved a sterile silver packet, the kind used for post-operative wound care. He tore it open with steady fingers and gently dabbed the thick, clear gel across his inflamed shoulder. Every touch stung like fire eating through nerve endings, but he made no sound. His face was stone, his breath regulated like a surgeon in the middle of a delicate procedure. Across the aisle, Callan Rusk leaned back in his seat and scoffed, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. "Look at that," he muttered to no one in particular, though his eyes were trained on Adrian. "Real men don't flinch." Leon, sitting just behind Adrian, clenched his fists, but Adrian raised one hand subtly, palm down, a signal to stay seated, stay quiet. It wasn't restraint born from fear. It was discipline. And that discipline was starting to rattle the very people who wanted to provoke him. Callan's smug expression began to falter. His eyes twitched toward the aisle. Something about Adrian's silence unnerved him now. The target wasn't reacting. He was absorbing, calculating, and Callan couldn't predict what came next. At the front of the cabin, 2 flight attendants murmured near the galley. Their voices were low, but Adrian's senses had sharpened. Pain did that. It narrowed your focus until the world became a tunnel, and in that tunnel, every word echoed. "Came from the top," one whispered, meant to test reaction time. Then a name slipped through the crack like a blade under skin. Ravel Corporation. Adrian's head turned slowly. His eyes locked on the attendants for half a second, enough to freeze them in place before they quickly turned their backs and busied themselves with silverware trays. A shiver rippled beneath his calm. Ravel. He had heard that name too many times lately. Just last quarter, Corin Dynamics had narrowly outbid Ravel Corporation for the Defense AI contract, a landmark win that had shifted the entire sector. Adrian had celebrated it cautiously, knowing powerful enemies were watching. But this wasn't backlash. This was premeditated. His fingers curled slowly around the empty hot sauce cup, still resting in the tray. The liquid had partially dried, its smell acrid and chemical. Not restaurant grade. Industrial. Adrian didn't need a lab to tell him something was added, something that shouldn't be on any commercial flight. His shoulder throbbed under the gel. Beneath the gauze, the fresh sutures from his car crash screamed for stillness, but Adrian's mind moved faster than the pain. The incident wasn't spontaneous. It was structured. Callan wasn't just a drunk passenger, Jace wasn't just an incompetent attendant, and the missing first aid kit, the refusal to call the captain, the carefully timed turbulence, it all traced back to something larger. He leaned back in his seat slowly, his face unreadable. Leon leaned forward from behind, whispering urgently, "You okay? Want me to talk to the crew again?" Adrian didn't answer right away. His eyes scanned the aisle, noting the passengers watching from behind phone screens and sunglasses. Then he turned slightly toward Leon, his voice low and firm. "Listen to me. They're not just trying to humiliate me. They're testing how far I'll go, how I'll break. This is being watched, maybe even timed." Leon's face tensed. "You think it's corporate?" "I don't think," Adrian said. "I know." He tapped twice on the tray table. The code. Leon instantly unlocked his phone and opened the encrypted recorder. Adrian spoke without looking at the lens, without raising his voice. "Flight 615, Helian Air, passenger Adrian Varon. Time of incident, mark it at 14 minutes after cruising altitude. Substance unknown, but chemical. Applied directly to a surgical site." Leon nodded silently, letting the camera roll. Callan shifted in his seat again. His confidence had started to decay, replaced by an unfamiliar discomfort. He glanced toward the cockpit, perhaps realizing that the man he had targeted wasn't reacting like a victim. He was documenting like an investigator. The sterile gel began to cool against Adrian's skin, its sting fading into dull heat. He flexed his fingers once and then exhaled through his nose. The battle was no longer just physical, it had turned procedural. Adrian didn't move as Jace passed again, pretending to check seatbelts. The attendant's eyes flicked toward him, full of something between guilt and fear. Adrian didn't look at him. Instead, he reached into the seat pocket and pulled out the safety card, flipping it over slowly until it faced the blank back. Then, with Leon's pen, he began to jot down a list. 5792. Callan Rusk, Seat 2C5793. Jace Mallon, Attendant Badge Number 3, 4285794. Absence of medical response 5795. Overheard keyword, Ravel Corporation. 5796. Target, Adrian Varon, 5,797. Objective, Haas, reaction. He underlined the last item twice, hard enough to indent the card. Leon, Adrian said quietly, not looking away from the list, we don't react. We record. Every word. Every glance Leon swallowed hard and nodded. Across the aisle, Callan pretended to yawn but kept sneaking glances at Adrian. The predator was starting to realize the prey had memorized the trap. Jace lingered near the galley again. Adrian watched as he bent to whisper something to the same attendant who had mentioned orders. The man nodded subtly, then pulled out a tablet, tapping quickly before disappearing through the curtain toward the cockpit. Adrian's eyes narrowed. Whatever happened next wouldn't be coincidence. He pressed his palm over the gauze-covered wound one more time, not to apply pressure but to remind himself that pain, when channeled, could become proof. He looked straight ahead, his voice low, cold and clear. "You're not tormenting a victim," he said. "You're building my evidence." Adrian moved first. Not with rage, not with fury, but with a surgical calm that unsettled the very air around him. As the final chime rang across the cabin, signaling the captain's descent announcement, the chaos of the last hour distilled into one sharp decision. Adrian Varon reached down slowly, his fingers brushing past the edges of his neatly arranged folder to retrieve a sealed, sterile packet. Inside it was a gel meant for wound treatment, emergency grade, clear, and cold. He opened it with the poise of a man performing an autopsy, not on a body, but on the moment itself. Across the aisle, Callan Rusk shifted in his seat, still smirking, still basking in the echo of his cruelty. He tapped his fingers on the armrest with faux casualness, but Adrian had already noticed the tremor beneath the swagger. Leon leaned in with a handful of tissues, pretending to help clean Adrian's shirt, but beneath the motions, his hand swabbed the cup for prints, slipping it into a Ziploc bag from Adrian's kit without drawing attention. Jace Mallon, the flight attendant who had delivered the tainted drink, returned once more, his tone meek, his hands slightly trembling. "I just want to apologize, sir," he said, offering another napkin. As he leaned forward, Adrian caught a glimpse just above the line of his inner forearm where the cuff of his sleeve slipped, was a tattoo, a minimalist emblem in dark blue ink. A symbol he'd seen before in a corporate intelligence file. The stylized double chevron of Revell Corporation's private contractor division. Not public, not for show. That symbol didn't belong on staff meant to serve passengers. Adrian's eyes narrowed as a click echoed in his mind. It was confirmation, not just of sabotage, but of a coordinated mission. They had planted a contractor on this flight. His calm intensified. Leon pressed closer under the guise of checking Adrian's bandage. "Got the prints," he murmured softly. "Cup, tissue, partial on the tray table." "Good," Adrian replied, barely moving his lips. "We're past the insult. Now we deal with the motive." The plane banked slightly as it began its final descent. Overhead bins clicked and passengers began to stir, loosening belts and stretching limbs. The regular rustle of arrival masked the rising tension between row 7 and the galley. But Callan made his move too early. He stood and reached for his carry-on, a large black duffel wedged in the overhead above Adrian's seat. Adrian rose without warning, stepping forward and blocking the aisle. The cabin paused. Phones came out like a reflex. Dozens of them. Some passengers didn't even know why. They simply sensed something about this moment demanded recording. The two men stood face to face. One dressed in arrogance, the other in resilience. Adrian's voice was low but carried like steel. "Did they tell you what was in that bottle?" Callan's hand froze mid-motion. He blinked once, the smirk thinning. "What bottle?" "This one," Adrian said, raising the nearly empty cup. The liquid inside had darkened slightly as it mixed with blood and saline from the gauze beneath his shirt. He tilted it slightly, letting the pungent scent drift outward. The smell wasn't just peppery heat. It was sharp, chemical, solvent. Callan's pupils flickered, the reaction of a man who had been given a script but not this page. Adrian didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. That wasn't hot sauce. It was an industrial-grade irritant, something meant for degreasing machine parts, mixed into something edible to bypass suspicion. The rows around them were dead silent. "You didn't just assault me," Adrian continued, his tone surgical. "You tried to erase me. My composure, my presence, my credibility. That's what you were hired to destroy." Callan's lips twitched, searching for a comeback, but found nothing. Behind him, Jace had disappeared into the galley, his steps hurried. Guilt has a sound. It's the silence that follows rushed feet. Adrian stepped aside as the fasten seatbelt sign chimed again. "You'll want your bag," he said coolly. "You'll be needing your ID shortly." As the wheels touched down with a soft yet final thud, the cabin remained unnaturally quiet. No applause, no chatter, just the sound of anticipation, like a courtroom awaiting a verdict. Leon leaned slightly toward Adrian as they began taxiing. "Security will be boarding in a minute." "I know," Adrian replied, never taking his eyes off Callan. "Now we see who pulls the strings." The moment of truth was only just landing with them. The aircraft door hissed open with a mechanical snap, and two uniformed security officers stepped briskly into the cabin. Their gazes swept down the aisle, faces stern, shoulders squared with rehearsed authority. Tension pulsed through the pressurized air like static. Passengers sat frozen, some clutching their phones, others wide-eyed and whispering. Adrian didn't move. He had expected this moment, but that didn't make it any less dangerous. Before the officers could speak, Callan leapt to his feet with dramatic flair, clutching his side as if wounded. "That man attacked me," he shouted, his voice ragged with false panic, fingers stabbing toward Adrian like a blade. His tone carried just enough desperation to trigger uncertainty. Gasps fluttered from nearby rows. One officer stepped forward, already reaching for the zip ties at his belt, but Adrian remained seated, composed and utterly unmoved. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't blink. Instead, he turned to Leon, who had been watching silently with his fingers already hovering over the tablet screen. "Play it," Adrian said calmly. Leon nodded and tapped. The tablet's screen lit up, and a clear time-stamped recording began to play. Laughter, the hot sauce, Callan's jeering face, the crimson liquid seeping into Adrian's bandage. Each moment rolled out in sharp, undeniable clarity. The officers paused, eyes narrowing as they leaned in, watching the footage in growing silence. Jace, standing near the galley, suddenly stepped forward, voice trembling with urgency. "It's not what it looks like," he blurted. "Mr. Varen provoked the passenger. He was aggressive. You didn't see what happened before." Adrian turned his head slowly, his gaze locking onto Jace. His voice dropped low, but every syllable hit like glass breaking. "If you're lying, you'd better lie consistently." The entire cabin fell into a hush. Even Callan's confidence faltered as murmurs rippled among the passengers. Several began whispering to the officers that they had seen the whole thing. Some even raised their own phones in silent confirmation. One of the officers, a younger man with dark stubble and a nervous twitch in his jaw, looked between the footage and Callan, his expression uncertain. "We're going to need all parties for questioning," he muttered. "No one's leaving just yet?" With that, the officer gestured for Adrian, Callan, and Jace to follow. The three men gathered their things slowly, each step toward the jet bridge stiff with unspoken consequences. Leon walked close behind, tablet still in hand, documenting every movement. A quiet hush had settled over the passengers, many watching as if the end of a film were playing live in front of them. The sterile white walls of the jet bridge seemed to close in tighter with every step. Adrian kept his breathing steady, his shoulder throbbing beneath the fabric of his blazer, but his mind was sharper than ever. This wasn't about guilt or innocence anymore. This was about leverage. power, perception. Just as they neared the terminal exit, one of the officers received a call on his shoulder radio. He stopped in his tracks and pressed the earpiece tight to his head. A long pause followed. Then he turned toward Adrian with a blank, unreadable face. "New orders," he said flatly. "Mr. Varon is to be detained for disruptive conduct." Leon stepped forward, voice rising. "What? You just saw the video. He didn't do anything. The officer didn't budge." "The directive comes from above," he said, avoiding eye contact. "I'm just following instructions." Adrian said nothing at first. His jaw tightened as he exhaled slowly, centering himself. His eyes scanned the corridor, already noting the security cameras, the badge numbers, the subtle delay in the officer's response. This wasn't procedural. This was pressure. He looked at Leon, who had gone pale with disbelief, and gave a subtle nod, permission to keep recording. No outrage, no panic, just quiet defiance. As the officer reached for his wrist, Adrian extended his hands willingly, watching the cuffs close like the final piece of a puzzle locking into place. It wasn't just a flight, he thought as his reflection passed in the glass of the terminal wall. It was an ambush, written mid-air. Inside the security office, the door slammed shut with a mechanical hiss, sealing Adrian Varon into a cold, sterile box of tension. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering once before holding steady, casting a sharp glare on the stainless steel table between him and the officer on duty. Adrian sat with his back straight, the pain in his bandaged shoulder pulsing with every breath, but his expression remained composed, almost unreadable. Across from him, Callan Rusk slouched in a chair, holding a cold compress to his cheek with theatrical exaggeration, wincing dramatically with each motion. Beside him stood Jace Mallon, whispering to a supervisor in a crisp Navy uniform. Their voices were low, but their intent wasn't subtle. Shape the narrative before the truth could speak. The supervisor, a man in his 50s with a square jaw and clipped mustache, turned to Adrian with an air of impatience. His badge read W. Halverson, and his narrowed eyes revealed skepticism before a single question left his lips. "Mr. Varon, I need your account of the incident on Flight 615. Start from the moment of the alleged disturbance." Adrian met his gaze without hesitation. "There was no disturbance until a substance, later identified by scent as hot sauce mixed with a chemical irritant, was poured on my injured shoulder," he said calmly, folding his hands on the table. "It was deliberate, and it was captured on video." "Convenient," Halverson muttered, scribbling something onto a clipboard. "And yet, this gentleman here," he gestured at Callan, "claims you attempted to assault him during the flight." Adrian didn't flinch. "If that were true, he wouldn't be sitting comfortably while I can barely lift my arm." From the adjacent observation room, Leon watched through a tinted one-way glass panel. He tapped rapidly on a tablet, transmitting both audio and visuals to Corin Dynamics' secure servers. The feed showed multiple angles of the flight incident. Callan's grin as he tipped the cup, Adrian's restrained reaction, the crew's visible hesitation. Every file was time-stamped, verified, and mirrored to 3 redundant backups. Leon's heartbeat quickened, not from fear, but urgency. They were inside enemy ground now, but the truth was already in flight. Back in the interrogation room, Adrian subtly rotated the bezel of his smartwatch twice to the left. A nearly invisible diode blinked once, activating a silent protocol. His watch began privately recording the conversation, syncing to an off-site storage bank designed for moments exactly like this. Evidence wasn't enough. It had to be protected from manipulation. "Mr. Varon," Halverson continued, flipping a page on his notepad, "there's a report from the flight crew indicating you were agitated during the flight, possibly aggressive. Would you like to address that?" Adrian's eyes darkened, but his voice remained level. "If silence and pain management are now classified as aggression, I'd like a full redefinition of the term submitted to my legal counsel." Callan gave a soft, mocking chuckle from his seat. He didn't like the joke. Got all high and mighty, acted like we spilled acid on royalty. Adrian turned to him slowly. You did more than spill something. You tested me, and you underestimated the result. Jace stepped forward, clearing his throat. Look, maybe we all overreacted. He was loud, the flight got tense, and you said nothing when he screamed, Adrian interrupted. His voice cut clean through the air. You brought me a cup filled with an unknown substance after watching another man taunt me. And you're only speaking now because the cameras are off. Halverson raised a brow. And you, Mr. Mallon? Jace looked caught between denial and deflection. He was acting strange. We were just following guidelines. Guidelines don't cover chemical burns. Adrian snapped, his first true note of emotion cracking through. Then he breathed deeply, regaining control. Where's the first aid report filed by the crew? Halverson flipped through the pages in front of him, frowning. There isn't one. Because they never filed it, Adrian said. There was no treatment. The kit was conveniently missing. And the communication line to the cockpit? Restricted. That's not protocol. That's premeditation. At that moment, the door opened. The younger of the two officers who had responded on the plane stepped in, holding a tablet under his arm. His expression was stiff, but his eyes shifted toward Halverson. He leaned down, whispering something quickly into the supervisor's ear. Halverson's posture changed. Slightly, but enough for Adrian to notice. I saw the footage, the officer murmured again, more audibly this time. It's not him. The air in the room thickened. Callan's shoulders tensed, his bravado slipping for the first time. Jace looked to the corner of the room, avoiding Adrian's gaze. Adrian leaned forward slightly, the faint blue light of his smartwatch reflecting in his eyes. Keep recording, Leon, he said, not to the people in the room, but to the truth on the other side of the glass. His voice was quiet but unshakable. Their own words will free us. He opened a bottle of hot sauce and poured it into the CEO's shoulder wound, laughing as the man screamed and the skin blistered. If you believe no one should harm the wounded and walk away, hit subscribe now, because justice never stays quiet. By evening, the news had already escaped containment. Adrian Varon stared at the glowing screen in the holding room as hashtags multiplied like wildfire. #, unruly executive, #, flight disruption, #, boardroom brute. The grainy footage had been clipped, edited, and stripped of context. In one version, it showed only Adrian standing, his expression tense, as Callan cowered dramatically with red-stained clothing. In another, Jace narrated a rehearsed version of events, describing Adrian as combative and emotionally unstable. The false narrative wasn't spreading naturally, it was being pushed, algorithmically propelled, and curated. Adrian leaned forward, his injured shoulder stiff beneath the bandage, and turned the screen toward Leon. This was never about the flight, he muttered. It's about erasure. Leon's fingers raced across his tablet, checking IP traces and metadata on the earliest posts. The first 5 accounts promoting the story all use the same VPN masking node, he said. And look at this. 2 of them link back to a marketing firm owned by Vestara subsidiaries. Adrian's eyes narrowed. Vestara was a known shell company under Revell Holdings. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The storm outside the walls was no longer accidental. It was engineered. The enemy wasn't simply in the cabin that morning. It was in boardrooms, server farms, and PR pipelines. A smear campaign wasn't just underway, it had already been launched, fully operational. Adrian stood slowly, ignoring the sting in his arm. I need one call. The officer at the door hesitated. You'll be given access after initial statements. Adrian turned to him with an expression honed over decades of leadership. Calm, direct, impossible to refuse. Delay this, he said, and you'll be explaining to a federal oversight board why you obstructed executive sabotage reporting. That did it. The man relented. Seconds later, Adrian was handed a secure landline. He dialed a memorized sequence. When the line picked up, he said only 3 words: "Initiate Protocol Delta." On the other end, Julian Kerr, head of Corin Dynamics Internal Security Operations, didn't ask questions. "Activating Delta now," he replied. Back inside Corin's underground server cluster, Kerr triggered the protocol Adrian had designed years ago for corporate emergencies. Surveillance intercepts, algorithmic trend tracking, leak analysis, and payroll triangulation. All engines roared to life. A wall of screens lit up. Data flooded in. Facial recognition systems began parsing news images for matches across contract databases. In the holding room, Leon received a silent notification. "They've started," he whispered. Across the room, Callan noticed Adrian's subtle confidence shift. He tilted his chair back smugly. "You think the truth matters?" he sneered, voice loud enough to carry over the hum of electronics. Adrian turned slowly, his gaze steady and unblinking. "It doesn't have to matter," he replied. "It only has to exist." Leon's tablet pinged. Kerr had found the connection. 2 entries lit up on the secure cloud, one showing Callan Rusk registered as an independent contractor under Vestara's Public Influence Operations Division, the other listing Jace Mallon under a discreet travel media consultancy labeled Flight Narrative Engineering, another Revell shell. Leon's eyes widened. "They're on Revell's payroll," he whispered, voice thick with disbelief. Adrian didn't move. He didn't gloat. He simply smiled, slightly, briefly, as though something invisible had just aligned. A faint static settled in the room. Outside the glass walls, officers paced with growing unease as murmurs spread. The energy was shifting. The air felt less like confinement and more like staging. Adrian exhaled, feeling the storm around him start to bend in a different direction. He turned back toward Leon. "Now," he murmured, "we start the reversal." The video hit the networks like a hammer. No warning, no soft rollout. Just a sudden broadcast. Adrian Varen's own unedited live feed from inside the security office streamed to every major business outlet by an anonymous drop. It opened with the still-burning image of Adrian's shoulder, soaked in red, the tremble in his fingers visible as he tried to stay composed. Then came the voices. Callan's laughter, sharp and cruel. Jace's hesitant whispers, torn between complicity and cowardice. And finally, the unmistakable sound of hot sauce splashing against gauze and wounded flesh. Viewers watched it all in real time, with the timestamp glowing in the corner of the screen like a courtroom clock. By the time Adrian stepped into the downtown Norvale Hotel lobby that morning, the world had already begun to shift. The video played silently on the lobby screen above the check-in desk, but it didn't need sound to command the room. Every eye followed it. Guests paused mid-conversation, mid-sip, mid-step. A businessman lowered his phone mid-text to watch. Even the concierge, half bent over a clipboard, froze as the footage reached the moment where Adrian clenched the armrest, refusing to retaliate. Leon followed close behind, phone in hand, already fielding dozens of missed calls. "It's everywhere," he said, glancing at the screen, then to Adrian's expressionless face. "Business outlets, tech blogs, even mainstream networks. The whole narrative's flipping." Adrian said nothing at first. He simply stood there, shoulders still bandaged beneath a dark overcoat, his eyes locked on the screen. It wasn't just his face staring back at him, it was his restraint, his refusal to be reduced to rage. The camera had caught not just an assault, but a decision. And now that decision was rewriting the airwaves. "Helion just issued a public statement," Leon added, lowering his voice. "They're suspending Callan and Jace pending an internal review." But he hesitated. "There's no apology yet." "They won't apologize," Adrian said quietly, turning toward the elevator. "Not until they're forced." As they ascended, Leon scrolled through the early headlines. Corporate assault or calculated smear. Executive scandal unravels with new footage. The CEO who didn't break. The tone had shifted, but not just toward sympathy. It was curiosity now. Suspicion. The kind of public mood that couldn't be silenced by a press release. Inside the suite, the television was already on. A panel of business analysts debated the implications while a sidebar looped clips from the footage. Callan tipping the cup, Jace looking away, Adrian wincing but not retaliating. One of the analysts, a former airline executive, leaned forward and said, "If these men were hired contractors, this goes far beyond an in-flight incident. It's corporate manipulation on a criminal scale." Leon dropped into a chair, eyes still on his phone. "We just got a formal request from the Independent Ethics Committee. They want an interview with you. And 2 of your major investors are asking for emergency calls. Now they're worried about Ravel's influence, not yours." Adrian removed his coat slowly, wincing slightly as it brushed the bandage beneath his collar. He moved to the window, gazing out at the city below. "Let them watch," he said. "Let them question everything. That's how it begins." He turned back, his voice calm but direct. "Now, we move past what happened. We show them why it happened. The who, the how, the motive, everything. We don't let them think this was just a moment. It was a machine. A strategy." Leon sat forward, already sensing the pace accelerating. "Then we use the Varen initiative?" "Not yet," Adrian said. "Right now, we don't lead with institutions. We lead with truth. Raw, undeniable truth." He walked to the counter where the half-burned cup from the flight sat under a sealed evidence container. He stared at it, at the faint streak of red that had dried along the rim. Not just hot sauce, he had already confirmed traces of chemical irritant, something not sold over any counter, something weaponized in intent, if not in name. Leon stood, energized now. "I'll draft the statement. Full release. We can name the substances used, link to the footage, outline the timeline. Just enough to make journalists dig deeper," Adrian gave a small nod. "And make sure we tag every outlet tied to Helion and Ravel, especially the ones that push the false narrative first. Let them feel their own echo turning on them." The hotel phone rang. Leon answered. It was one of their legal advisors, breathless. "Ravel's PR is backpedaling. They just deleted 4 posts and closed the comment sections. Some of their smaller affiliates are trying to issue separate statements. They're fragmenting," Adrian murmured. "Good." He looked at Leon with sharpened focus. "Tell Kerr to archive everything. Every article, every tweet, every false claim. We'll build a timeline of distortion, show the pattern, make the media complicit, not just observers outside, clouds gathered over the Norvale skyline, casting long shadows across the glass towers." Adrian didn't notice. He was already scripting the next move in his mind, the one that would expose not just the attack, but the architecture behind it. Leon's voice broke the silence. "What's next?" Adrian didn't hesitate. His voice was low, unwavering. "We don't just prove what happened. We prove why it did." His calm voice concealed the storm to come. "They wanted humiliation. I'll give them history." 2 days later, Adrian received the encrypted message while reviewing procurement protocols in his corner office. The message was short, just a string of access codes and a single sentence from Julian Kerr. "Found the pattern." Adrian didn't hesitate. He closed his office door, dimmed the lights, and accessed the secure server. Within seconds, a digital dossier unfolded on his screen. There were 3 cases, each nearly identical to his. Targeted CEOs humiliated in controlled environments just before major contract decisions. One had been falsely accused of harassment in a hotel lobby. Another had been framed for violent conduct at a trade expo. All 3 had lost their bids. All 3 incidents had been filmed, broadcast, and distorted. At the center of every scandal, Revell Corporation. Adrian leaned back in his chair, his bandaged shoulder pulsing. The pieces fit too perfectly. This wasn't coincidence. It was choreography. A playbook of reputational sabotage with Adrian as the latest intended casualty. He didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he scheduled a press conference for the next morning and alerted Kerr. Make sure the chain of custody is clear. I want timestamps, payment records, server logs, everything. His voice was flat, but inside, he was already writing the script that would flip the entire narrative. The next day, a wall of reporters gathered at Corin Dynamics Media Hall. The room buzzed, cameras rolling, microphones live, their eyes expectant. Adrian stepped to the podium wearing a charcoal suit, his left arm still partially in a brace. There was no podium thumping, no dramatic pause. He simply began. I was targeted, he said, but I wasn't the first. He tapped a button. Behind him, a screen flickered to life. The footage began. Callan Rusk laughing, the deliberate tilt of the hot sauce bottle, Adrian's wince of pain, Jace's hesitation. Then came the overlays. Callan's contractor profile under Revell's public relations division, payment logs from a ghost subsidiary, digital footprints leading back to a media firm owned by Revell Holdings. The crowd fell into stunned silence. I want to be clear, Adrian continued, his voice steady. This wasn't about discomfort on a plane. This was about dismantling a person in public view, one frame at a time, to win a contract that should have been earned, not stolen. Reporters whispered to one another, some already typing headlines. He wasn't finished. The same tactics were used against at least 3 other executives over the past year. In each case, the outcome was the same. The target was humiliated, the footage leaked, and Revell secured the contract. He tapped again. Emails appeared, internal memos from Revell's staff referring to Adrian as optically clean, easy to provoke, and perfect for a credibility break. The phrases chilled the room. They mistook composure for weakness, Adrian said. They believed restraint would silence me. One reporter raised a hand. What's your response to Revell's official statement that this was a misunderstanding involving unaffiliated contractors? Adrian didn't blink. Then let them explain why those same contractors received wired bonuses 3 days after the incident, logged from a Revell-owned account. Gasps followed, but Adrian's face remained calm. I'm not after revenge. I'm after restoration, he said. That moment hit like a thunderclap. There was no need to shout. The truth, framed plainly, carried more power than outrage ever could. Behind the scenes, Kerr was already submitting the formal petition to federal regulators, demanding an investigation into Revell's practices and calling for ethical reform in corporate lobbying. In the final seconds of the broadcast, Adrian faced the cameras again. His final words came low and steady. The man they tried to humiliate was about to rewrite the rules of corporate warfare. Callan Rusk's voice cracked on the witness stand. I didn't mean to hurt him, he muttered, eyes flicking toward the defense table where Dr. Adrian Varon sat with his hands folded, expression unreadable. They told me it would just make him snap, make him look unstable. The courtroom was silent except for the clicking of reporters' keyboards. Everyone waited. Judge Canner, a stoic man with deep-set eyes and a reputation for cutting through theatrics, leaned forward. Who told you to do this, Mr. Rusk? Who paid you? Callan hesitated. His hands trembled as he reached for the glass of water beside him. His suit was too tight around the neck now. Revell, he whispered. Revell Corporation. A man named Lowell Doran. Said they needed footage. Proof that Dr. Varon couldn't handle pressure. The air shifted. Not a gasp, not a shout, just the unmistakable weight of a room tilting toward revelation. Adrian didn't move, but Leon, seated a few rows back, allowed himself a brief exhale. This was it. The first crack in the wall. The prosecution's lead attorney, Malcolm Trent, stood. "Your Honor, we request the court admit into evidence the financial transaction records from Revell Holdings. These include direct payments made to Callan Rusk and Jace Mallon, labeled as Public Operations Consulting." He walked with measured steps to the screen and tapped twice. A spreadsheet blinked to life, neat rows, damning numbers. The courtroom saw it. Payments traced through shell subsidiaries. Descriptions coded but unmistakable. Then came the video. Leon had cleaned it, enhanced the audio. The moment Callan poured the hot sauce into the cup, the laughter, the camera angle that caught Jace's face twitching with discomfort. It was all there, and in the center of it, Adrian's composed reaction, gritting his teeth, clenching his jaw, never raising his voice. It played without narration. The images said enough. When the footage ended, Judge Canner nodded once. Admitted. Reporters scribbled notes faster. One headline was already forming: The Corporate Cruelty Scandal. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered behind makeshift barricades. Some held signs that read, "Justice for Varon," while others called for a full federal inquiry into Revell's influence in the corporate sector. The ripple was becoming a wave. Inside, the defense tried to pivot. Revell's counsel, a sharp-suited man named Clark Lennox, stood to cross-examine. "Dr. Varon," he began, approaching slowly, "you claim this was all orchestrated. But isn't it true you were under immense stress before the flight? Isn't it possible you overreacted?" Adrian turned to him, voice calm. "Stress doesn't fabricate digital payment records. It doesn't create forensic traces of industrial-grade irritants in hot sauce bottles. And it certainly doesn't convince a man to admit, under oath, that he was paid to trigger me." Lennox opened his mouth to reply, but Judge Canner cut in. "Move on, Mr. Lennox." The next witness was Dr. Shane Allard, a forensic toxicologist. He took the stand and pulled no punches. The substance applied to Dr. Varon's surgical site was not culinary-grade hot sauce, he explained, adjusting his lab coat as he addressed the courtroom. It contained capsaicin extract and a trace solvent used in industrial cleaning. This wasn't an accident. This was weaponized irritation he handed over the chemical analysis reports. Adrian watched the reactions ripple again. Eyes widened. Journalists whispered. One juror covered his mouth. The courtroom recessed for the day. As Adrian stepped into the hallway, flashbulbs burst. Questions flew. "Dr. Varon, do you believe Revell's CEO knew? Was this politically motivated? Are you seeking personal damages or industry reform?" He ignored them all. Not out of arrogance, but purpose. He had chosen not to fight this in the court of public opinion, but he knew it would reach there anyway. Back in the hotel suite, Leon opened his laptop. "We found more," he said quietly. "Internal memos. They labeled you an ideal collapse point. Said you'd either lose your temper or lose investor trust." Adrian didn't blink. They misunderstood something fundamental. Leon looked up. "What's that?" They thought dignity was a weakness. The following morning, hearings resumed. Callan returned to the stand for final testimony. His posture had crumbled. No longer the smirking saboteur from Flight 615, he looked like a man who had watched his own soul on replay. "I was wrong," he admitted, voice hoarse. "I didn't know how far it would go. I didn't think he'd stay silent. That was the whole point, make him look angry, out of control." He paused. But he didn't. He stayed still, and that scared me more than anything. Adrian sat unmoved. Finally, the judge turned to him. "Dr. Varon, is there anything you wish to say?" Adrian stood slowly. The entire room quieted. "I came here not to punish, but to reveal," he began. "Not because I was hurt, but because truth was hurt. This was never just about a flight. It was about a system that rewards humiliation and punishes restraint." He looked to Callan. "I don't hate you," Adrian said. "You were a tool in someone else's hand." But even tools must bear the weight of what they strike. The judge nodded solemnly. The proceedings adjourned for the day. As Adrian stepped outside into the soft wind, Leon joined him, carrying a messenger bag heavy with evidence. Behind them, the courthouse buzzed, but ahead of them, the road was open. A reporter called out one last question. "Do you forgive them?" Adrian paused. He didn't smile, didn't turn, only said without hesitation, "Forgiveness," he said, "is earned through truth, not apology." The envelope hit the desk with a soft slap, its contents still warm from the courier's hand. Adrian didn't flinch. He had been expecting it. Inside was a resignation letter, the final one. Revell Corporation's CEO had stepped down under mounting pressure, citing personal health and organizational restructuring. The truth was louder than the ink it was printed in. Accountability had finally come knocking. But Adrian Varon had already moved past victory. He wasn't chasing headlines. He was building something no smear campaign could touch. That same morning, he sat across from Leon in the sunlit corner of Corin Dynamics' 37th floor, shoulders still stiff under his tailored jacket, scar hidden but present. "It's time," Adrian said. Leon nodded, already pulling up the charter documents. The Varon Initiative had been in planning for weeks, but now it was real. Funded independently, staffed by forensic analysts, legal strategists, and cybersecurity architects, its goal was clear: expose psychological and reputational sabotage across the corporate sector and stop it before it ever reached another boardroom, tarmac, or inbox. "We'll need allies," Leon said, scanning through potential board candidates, "and discretion. This isn't just about one company's tactics. This is about how the whole game is played." Adrian leaned back, eyes narrowing on the cityscape. "Then let's change the rules." Within days, a discreet recruitment effort began. Former whistleblowers, retired ethics officers, and even a few disillusioned PR agents came forward, men tired of spinning lies for paychecks. They were trained not only in documentation but in pattern recognition, body language analysis, and data forensics. Adrian ensured every member of the initiative understood one principle above all: silence could be a weapon, but so could truth. Weeks passed, but momentum only built. They launched a secure platform allowing anonymous corporate professionals to report red flag incidents without fear of retaliation. Within the first 72 hours, 12 credible cases surfaced, ranging from digitally altered memos used to frame employees to staged leaks designed to derail product launches. The threads ran deeper than anyone had predicted. Adrian watched it unfold not as a CEO, but as an architect of resistance. It was in Geneva where the message went global. At the International Ethics Conference, with delegates from over 40 nations seated beneath soft golden chandeliers, Adrian stood at the podium. He wore no flashy pin or grand title, just a charcoal suit and quiet resolve. The auditorium stilled as he spoke. "This isn't just about business," Adrian said, his voice even, eyes scanning the room. "It's about what we've allowed the idea of competition to become. When power learns to humiliate, humanity must learn to remember." For a beat, silence. Then thunderous applause. The words echoed long after the event ended, replayed across international broadcasts, quoted in editorial columns. Requests poured in for guidance, support, and training partnerships. The Varon Initiative was no longer a private mission. It had become a movement. That evening, back in Norvale, Adrian stood alone on the balcony of his high-rise apartment. The sky pulsed with soft orange and lavender streaks as the sun dropped below the skyline. The cool wind slid across his shoulder, stirring the faint ache beneath the scar, an echo of pain he no longer feared. Behind him, the quiet hum of encrypted messages and satellite calls continued, Leon's voice occasionally rising with updates and confirmations. But Adrian didn't turn around yet. He gripped the railing, staring out over a city he once thought was ruled only by force and strategy. Now he knew better. He had proven that calm could be more disruptive than rage, that restraint could unravel giants, that even the quietest wounds could lead revolutions if carried the right way. He exhaled slowly, letting the wind take the words with it. "Pain doesn't define us," he murmured to himself. "Response does." The parcel arrived just after lunch. It was small, unmarked, and addressed simply to Dr. Adrian Varon. The courier didn't linger. He placed it on the reception desk, nodded at security, and vanished into the revolving glass doors of Koran Dynamics. No return label, no postage, just a plain brown package with edges so sharply folded they seemed intentional. Adrian was in his office when Leon brought it up. This was dropped off. No signature. "Thought you should open it," Leon said, his tone cautious. Adrian glanced up from the tablet he was annotating. The rain, tapping softly against the panoramic window behind him, filled the room with a rhythmic hush. He took the parcel with a slow, steady hand. The weight was oddly familiar, light, with a delicate rattle. He peeled away the tape. Inside, nestled in a bed of crumpled brown paper, was a glass bottle, the same brand of hot sauce that had burned his healing shoulder weeks ago. But the label was gone. In its place was a strip of white paper, handwritten in elegant black ink, "We failed to break you." For a long moment, Adrian said nothing. He didn't flinch. He didn't speak. He only stared at the bottle, his fingers tightening slightly as if resisting an old instinct to crush it. The office felt colder somehow, the world narrowing to this object, a relic not just of pain, but of intention. Someone had sent this as a message. Whether it was a warning, confession, or twisted respect was unclear. But it didn't matter. With the same composure he had wielded on that flight, Adrian rose, walked to the glass display shelf behind his desk, and opened the lower cabinet. He removed the sealed evidence cup, the one Leon had preserved, still faintly stained with red and bearing the faintest trace of solvent. He placed both the cup and the bottle on a square of polished obsidian glass, then lowered a thick glass dome over them. Twin artifacts, one of cruelty, one of survival. Leon stood at the threshold, watching. "You okay?" he asked softly, stepping into the office. Adrian turned to him, eyes unreadable but calm. "More than okay. This tells me we didn't just win the case. We cracked their mask." Leon held out a tablet. "Update from the Varon Initiative. 3 more tech firms just joined. One of them used to be on Ravel's advisory board." Adrian nodded. The tide wasn't just turning, it had begun to sweep the shoreline clean. The Varon Initiative was no longer just a defense mechanism. It had become a movement, a coalition. What began as Adrian's retaliation had evolved into an alliance of firms determined to dismantle corporate sabotage from the inside. "And this," Leon added, "came with the data packet." He handed Adrian a folded printout. It was a decrypted chain of internal Ravel messages, part of the investigation's final sweep. One line stood out: "Target's resistance exceeds projections." Shift from provocation to discreditation failed. Psychological isolation ineffective. Adrian smirked faintly. They had studied him like a threat profile, mapped his habits, underestimated his silence. "They built strategies to unmake me," he said quietly, "and all they did was build my foundation." The sun dipped below the skyline, casting golden light across the floor-to-ceiling windows. Office lights flickered on automatically, soft and warm. But Adrian walked to the switch and turned them off manually, one by one, until only the faint ambient glow of the city remained. The framed artifacts caught the last edge of light. Their reflections shimmered faintly on the glass surface of his desk. He stood before them, the lines in his brow deepening, not with age, but with clarity. The bottle and the cup were no longer symbols of trauma. They were evidence of resilience. Each bore the fingerprints of the ones who tried to destroy him, and the fingerprints of the man who refused to be moved. Leon said nothing more. He understood the silence now. It was never about fear. It was about control. As Adrian prepared to leave for the night, he gave the relics one final glance. Then, in a voice just above a whisper, he said, "Every wound has its architect, but so does every recovery." And with that, he turned off the final light, leaving only the faint reflection of the glass bottle glimmering in the dark, a quiet reminder of victory forged through composure. The storm that tried to destroy him became the reason he rebuilt the sky. He scorched another man's flesh and seconds later felt the same flame sear across his own face. If you believe justice always returns to the cruel, subscribe now, because every burn finds its way home. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores racism, cruelty, and the breaking point that drives a person to stand up against oppression. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and spark reflection on justice, equality, and human dignity.